Welcome to Nutrition 2 as part of the ANSI 1101 Introductory Animal Science course. This little video is on energy, which comes from primarily carbohydrates and fats. A lot of the energy that we feed to animals comes from carbohydrates. As mentioned in the last video, carbohydrates are made up of three elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And carbohydrates generally in this ratio, about 40% carbon, just a little hydrogen, and over half oxygen on a weight basis. Carbohydrates include sugars, starches, cellulose, which is more fibrous, and miscellaneous others. As far as when we're feeding animals, if they're monogastrics, most of the energy is going to be coming as starch. If they're ruminants or hindgut fermenters like horses, most of the energy may come from cellulose. Simple carbohydrates to complex. So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen make up 75% of the plant dry weight and represents the largest part of an animal's food supply. Carbohydrates are formed by photosynthesis, as you may have learned in biology, and here's the formula. So plants take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Plants need water, so we've got 6 molecules of each here. And then we get the energy from sunlight. And with this much energy from sunlight, we get a simple sugar produced, plus the plants give off oxygen. Well, this is just a little human interest slide that I'm throwing in here. A sea slug, which is an animal, was discovered off the coast of New England in 2009. Anyway, here's an animal that produces its own chlorophyll so it can carry out photosynthesis. And prior to this discovery, it was thought that only plants get energy from sunlight, and now we know animals can as well. You know, there is a possibility that we could genetically engineer some of our grazing animals where they could possibly get some of their energy directly from sunlight. So plants are made up of mostly carbohydrates, but there are very little carbohydrates present in an animal's body. Plants use the carbohydrates for structure, you know, so the corn plant doesn't fall down or the tree doesn't fall down, and that's fiber. And also store carbohydrates as energy. Maybe in sugars, but usually it's in the form of starch. Animals have bone for structure and store energy as fats. Carbohydrates themselves can be classified in different categories. We're starting out here with a simple molecule, one sugar molecule, and there's different forms of sugar. Most of you have probably heard of fructose, high fructose corn syrup, sweetest sugar known, and that's why we like it, I guess, in our soda pop. Glucose is blood sugar. We'll talk about animals being low in energy, maybe low in blood glucose. Galactose, necessary for good brain formation and brain function. We have mannose, obtained from both polysaccharides. Cranberry juice may be high in this. Generally, we don't have requirements or nutritional requirements for sugar, but we do utilize sugar for energy, definitely. And if we want animals to maybe perform a little more or get more energy into animals, Sugar is a fast form of energy, and sugars are also very palatable. Animals will eat more a lot of times if we put simple sugars in their diets. Well, honey has two main sugars in honey, glucose, which were mentioned already, and levulose is a fructose, with just a little different formation. 5 carbon sugars are part of, and this is outside of honey, 5 carbon sugars are part of DNA, RNA, and viruses. Simple sugars are absorbed in the bloodstream without further digestion in the digestive tract. So these are simple molecules. When you consume sugar, it can go directly into the bloodstream, and that's why we get that sugar high, which is not necessarily all that healthy for us. Disaccharides are two sugar molecules. So lactose, we only find lactose in milk. It's also known as milk sugar, and milk from a dairy cow contains about 5% lactose. Anyway, lactose is made up of galactose and glucose. You need the enzyme lactase in our small intestine to break down the lactose into these two simple sugars, which can be absorbed into our bloodstream. If you lack lactase, then the sugar continues down to the large intestine, and then bacteria will break it down and also form gas and give us digestive upsets. So it's really important in any animals to have lactase. A lot of our mammals, as they get older, they quit producing lactase. So even though they may drink milk as young animals, later on they may have a hard time digesting it. Okay, sucrose, generally known as table sugar, and we'll get that from sugar beets and sugar cane. It's made up of two simple sugars, fructose and galactose. And again, you need the enzyme sucrase to break it down. A lot of times younger animals lack sucrase, so if you're nursing, feeding a young animal out of a bottle, adding table sugar might be the wrong thing to do. Maltose, used in malted milk, kind of has a distinct flavor, just made up of two glucose. This is just kind of a little funny slide here, example of lactose intolerant, and people that lack the enzyme lactase, we say are lactose intolerant, and again, the lactose will be broken down eventually, but it's broken down by bacteria in the large intestine, which can lead to diarrhea and gaseous uncomfortability in the large intestine. All right, polysaccharides are just many sugars, simple sugars connected together with chemical bonds. So glycogen, that's an animal form of a carbohydrate. We have a limited amount of glycogen stored in our muscles, which we can use for quick energy. Starches, it's just glucose is connected with alpha bonds. Alpha bonds are relatively easy to break apart. Starches are generally pretty easy to digest. And then we have cellulose and hemicellulose. Difference between these is hemicellulose generally contains cellulose plus other cell contents. Hemicellulose generally a little easier for animals to digest maybe than cellulose. But we have the beta bonds there, and so you need enzymes to break down those the cellulose. Mammals do not produce the enzyme, but we have ruminants and hindgut fermenters in which the bacteria break down cellulose. So you need bacteria in the digestive system to break down cellulose. So this is the digestion process in a ruminant animal such as a cow or a goat or a sheep or a deer. So they eat cellulose, and so they evolved as foragers. They'll eat a lot of grass, which is mainly cellulose. And the bacteria produce the enzyme cellulase, which breaks down the cellulose into glucose. And then we have bacteria further that ferment the glucose, break that down into VFAs or volatile fatty acids. The volatile fatty acids are just 3 or 4 carbon in length, so they're very small. They're absorbed right through the rumen wall, so they do not have to wait to get into the small intestine to be absorbed. So they're absorbed quickly. The liver will then convert these volatile fatty acids into blood glucose. Depending upon what you're feeding the cow, these are the 3 main volatile fatty acid, propionate, and generally it's going to be produced at 30 to 40%. Butyric acid produced at a smaller amount, and the most common volatile fatty acid produced is acetic acid at 50 to 60% of the VFAs. Acetic acid is a very good precursor for milk fat, so the acetic acid gets into the bloodstream, can go right through the mammary system, and the mammary system converts the acetic acid to milk fat very efficiently. For animal science purposes, these terms are used interchangeably. Propionic acid, same as propionate. Butyric acid, same as butyrate. And acetic acid, same as acetate. So if you see these terms, they're used interchangeably, and so you don't have to worry about it. Well, I just threw these volatile fatty acids on the slide here so you can see they're relatively small, simple compounds that are easily absorbed into the bloodstream, right through the rumen wall, or if they get down further down the digestive tract, they can be absorbed through the stomach wall or small intestine as you go along there. You do not need to memorize these structures in any way for this exam. It's just kind of interesting to see what they might look like. And we've got a few other structures and definitions that we need to talk about here. Lignin is the indigestible structural component of plants, and animals do not get nutrition from lignin. Lignin is not a carbohydrate. It gives a lot of structure and stiffness to the plants. It's necessary for the plants, but having a lot of lignin in our feed stuff can really cut down the digestibility of that feed stuff. Crude fiber, we a lot of times link several carbohydrates into the term crude fiber. In NDF versus ADF, we'll be discussing that later in this chapter as we talk about the nutritional analysis of feedstuffs. So carbohydrates, where do they come from? And grains generally are relatively high in starch. You cut open that corn kernel, and inside it's white. Starch is white, very easily digested. Grain tends to be high in energy. The C code is fibrous, and just like humans, having a little bit, at least a little bit of fiber in the diet can be healthy for the digestive tract. although the digestibility of that fiber might be relatively low. Forages, like hay and silages, high in fiber, low in starch. And depending upon the quality and percent lignin in the forages can be highly digestible or fairly lowly digestible. As far as lactose, of course, cow's milk is 5% lactose, and that's 40% of the solids in milk. Different species will vary as far as percent lactose and percent fat in the milk as a form of energies. And what are the functions of these carbohydrates? Well, they generate heat to maintain body temperature as we digest those carbohydrates. They fuel metabolic reactions, they provide energy. Building blocks for other nutrients, and if we get a surplus of energy, we can store that energy in the form of fat and then use at a later time. Well, this is just the chemical formulas for those sugars and starches and cellulose. And the sugars, of course, 6-carbon chain sugars, and then the starch and the cellulose connected by those alpha and beta bonds. Well, now we're going to move into the fats portion. Just a little definition starting out here. The term lipid, sometimes referred to as just synonymous for fats, but fats are actually a subgroup of lipids, and fats are triglycerides, and we'll be looking at that chemical structure in just a little bit here. Lipids also encompass molecules such as fatty acids and their derivatives, as well as steroid-containing metabolites such as cholesterol, waxes, and the fat-soluble vitamins are lipids as well. Here is the only pie chart that you're going to see in any of my lectures, although back in the poultry section I guess there might be a pie chart, but this is a very accurate pie chart. Alright, let's get into the fats. Here's the chemical composition and how it differs as far as ratio of carbon versus oxygen from carbohydrates to the fats. Fats are insoluble in water, and a unit of fat contains more energy than carbohydrates. A unit of fat, whether that's in grams or pounds, contains 2.25 times more energy than a unit of carbohydrate. So we say that fats are triglycerides. What does that mean? We've got a glycerol backbone here, and then we've got 3 fatty acids attached to that fat. These fatty acids can vary a lot in length, how many carbons are connected, or whether they're saturated or not with hydrogens. Plants that we feed to animals will contain a small amount of lipids or fats. We feed a lot of corn to animals, and corn does contain corn oil in a small amount. Forages will usually have a little less fat than will our grains. But even though plants do contain some lipids or fats, a lot of times we'll add animal fats to an animal's feed. And these are 3 reasons why we may want to add fats to feeds. Generally, fats are more expensive than carbohydrates, so we're not going to add fats unless there's a good reason to do so. So we might want to increase the energy density. We just want the animals to produce more milk, maybe help maintain body condition, just need more energy in the diet. It will help to decrease dust in the feed, and by decreasing dust, we'll increase the palatability and will decrease the dustiness in the confinement building. So we'll actually have better air quality for the animals. As a binder, we make pellets. It helps the pellets stick together better so they don't crumble apart and become real dusty. Non-ruminants tend to like the taste of fat. Ruminants not so much. So non-ruminants, dogs, cats, pigs, if we add some fat to the diet, usually they'll enjoy the feed more and maybe eat more. And fats are needed in cat diets. So here is just illustrating the structure of fats. Again, we have the glycerol, and then we're going to add 3 fatty acids. So here's the glycerol with the fatty acids added. This R just represents repeating carbons out here. So we may have a small, short fatty acid or relatively long fatty acid. And the structure of the fats will influence how much energy they contain and also change blood profiles as well. So fatty acids can range from just 2 carbons to 24 carbons. Shorter chain fatty acids are generally digested at a faster rate than long chain, but fats in general tend to be fairly highly digestible and provide a lot of energy. Alright, saturation of our fats or fatty acids. What does it mean? So here we have a carbon chain, and each of the carbons are saturated with hydrogens. So from a carbon, you get 4 connections, and it's saturated. All right. So different fats. Some on any one fat, you could have 50% of the carbons fat, or 50% of the fatty acids saturated and 50% not, or you could be mostly saturated or mostly unsaturated. Saturated fats tend to be solid at room temperature, and as far as degree of saturation, ruminants tend to have the most saturated fat. And so if you're looking at cattle, beef, sheep, it's relatively saturated because the microbes in the rumen will saturate any unsaturated fats that the animals consume. So tallow tends to be pretty firm. Lard from pork tends to be a little more unsaturated. And for these non-ruminant animals, the degree of saturation will really depend upon what the animals are fed. If you feed saturated fats to pigs or poultry, their fat that they deposit is going to be more saturated. So if we're looking at unsaturated fats, plant fats or plant oils, since they're liquid at room temperature, rather than calling them fats, a lot of times we just call them oils. And there are a lot of plant oils that we use in human consumption, including corn oil, soybean oil, canola oil, and there are others as well that you might find in the food store. Polyunsaturated just means there's more than one double bond, so this would be an example of a polyunsaturated fatty acid. The more saturated a fat, the more solid or harder that it's going to be at room temperature. As the molecular weight increases, by molecular weight, we're referring to number of carbons in that carbon chain. As that increases from 2 to 24 carbons in length, the fats tend to be more solid at room temperature. Now the fatty acids can range from 2 to 24 carbons in length, but there are 100 different fatty acids when you consider the degree of unsaturation that you might have in those fatty acids, and where along the carbon chain you're going to find the carbons that are unsaturated. And that can really affect the maybe characteristics of those fats. Butyric acid, relatively short chain fatty acid, just 4 carbons. And here we have linoleic acid, 18 carbons in length, and this particular fatty acid is polyunsaturated in that there's double bonds that occur in a couple different locations along that fatty acid. And here is myristic acid, and so this is a saturated fatty acid, as you can see. And in beef or a ruminant animal, you may find quite a bit of myristic acid, which is again totally saturated. Okay, functions of fat. What do they do? Well, they store energy, obviously, and a lot of times for animals, even in the wild, during the summertime, animals in the wild may get fattened up, and you go into the fall with quite a bit of fat, especially for animals that might hibernate during the winter. So they need that fat storages to survive a long winter. Protect their organs, and so there's internal fat that kind of around the kidneys, the reproductive tracts, help insulate the vital organs there. Insulate the body. Fat is a good insulator, again, for those animals going into a cold winter. Energy source in the food, obviously, although most plants tend to be relatively low in fats, they do contain some. Essential fatty acids are needed for prostaglandin production, and when we go and get into the reproduction section in introductory animal science, we talk about prostaglandin, but prostaglandin actually has quite a few different functions in the mammalian body. And we have the fat-soluble vitamins, and they're found in the fat. Well, a lot of times for human nutrition, we try to limit the energy in the foodstuffs. Obviously, for pigs, they don't have to worry about it as much. Fats tend to be very highly digestible, but well, 100% if they stay in the reproductive tract long enough. A lot of times animals are consuming more food, and the new incoming food pushes out the food in the digestive tract before it's totally digested. But usually fats tend to be at least 85% digestible. Your shorter chain fatty acids are digested just a bit faster than the long chain fatty acids. And you do need an enzyme to break down that triglyceride. So lipase breaks down the triglycerides into glycerol and the fatty acids, which then can be utilized. Where are fats found in our bodies? Well, milk, of course, contains fat, and it'll vary a lot by species and even breeds within species. Horses have a lower percent fat, only 1.5%. So, and little foals do not grow as fast as some of our other species. Cows, depending upon the breed, and there's quite a bit of genetic variation for percent fat in cow's milk. From 3% to 6%, I'd say. Sheep tend to be higher in fat, water buffalo is up around 8% fat. And then we can have whales, which are mammals, of course, where you have a much, much higher percent fat. Eggs contain about 10% fat, and of course that chick that needs to all the energies in that egg for the first 21 days of that life of that chick. And there's internal fat. We said that fat insulates the vital organs, and KPH stands for kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. And there's fat between the muscle fibers to help with lubrication. And we have external body fat, kind of outside of the body cavity. Animals, just like people, do not deposit fat uniformly along the body. So cattle, for example, deposit more fat around the tail head and maybe on the upper ribs. A good place to estimate fat disposition on animals is looking down in the brisket area. And then also in the flank area, you're going to find fat deposited. You're not going to find fat deposited very much over the ribs compared to the rest of the animal. Well, that concludes the Nutrition 2 on energy, including the carbohydrates and the fats. And I hope you learned a little bit in this video, and you're having a good day.